Somewhere in the distant past, a child was born. Nothing unusual about that. Births happened constantly. The band moved, hunted, survived. Children arrived and either made it or they didn't. But this particular child was different. Visibly, undeniably, physically different from every single person around them. Different skull shape, different features, different proportions. Something in the genes had shifted. Not randomly, not slightly, but enough that anyone looking at this child could see it. Here's the question nobody wants to sit with. What did the group do? We need to talk about mutation, not the comic book version, the real version, quiet, invisible, happening right now in every living thing on the planet, including you. Every human born carries somewhere between 50 and 100 new genetic mutations that neither of their parents had. Most of those mutations do nothing. Some cause problems, and occasionally, rarely unpredictably, one of them does something genuinely new. That's how evolution works. Not through grand design, not through intention, through a copying error that happened to be useful, passed down through generations until it became the norm. Every trait that makes you recognizably human started exactly this way. Upright posture, language capacity, the whites of your eyes, a mutation in someone, at some point, who was surrounded by people who didn't have it yet. That first person was different. Conspicuously, visibly, undeniably different, and the group noticed. Let's make this concrete. Take the FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene, though that's a dramatic oversimplification. What it actually does is regulate the fine motor control needed for complex speech. Humans have a version of FOXP2 that differs from chimpanzees by just 2 amino acid changes. 2 out of hundreds. Those 2 changes are part of what gave us language. But here's what that means in practice. The first human born with those mutations didn't suddenly start speaking in full sentences. They had a slightly enhanced capacity for vocal precision. Maybe imperceptible. Maybe subtle enough that even they didn't know something was different about how sound moved through them. Or maybe it was obvious. Maybe they could produce sounds no one around them had ever heard before. Maybe they could control their mouth and throat in ways that looked, to everyone watching, deeply strange. Now here's where it gets genuinely complicated. We assume evolution is about survival of the fittest. Strongest wins, weakest dies, traits that help get passed on. Clean. Logical. A system with no room for sentiment. But that's not quite what the fossil record shows. Because what the fossil record shows is that early humans were taking care of each other in ways that complicate that story completely. Skeletal remains tell stories. A Neanderthal skeleton found in Shanidar Cave in Iraq, estimated to be around 40 years old at death, which was ancient for the time, showed healed injuries that would have been completely debilitating. A withered arm, severe damage to the eye socket, fused vertebrae that would have caused chronic pain and limited mobility for years. This individual survived those injuries, survived them long enough for the bones to heal, which means other people kept them alive, fed them, protected them, carried them when necessary. This wasn't isolated. Other sites across Europe and Asia show similar evidence. Individuals with conditions that should have been death sentences, living to middle age or beyond because their group chose to keep them alive. Whatever killed them eventually, it wasn't abandonment. So what does that mean for our person, the one born visibly, genetically different? Depends entirely on what different meant. Different in a way that reduced capacity, couldn't run, couldn't hunt, couldn't carry. That was a real problem in a world where every member of a small band needed to contribute. Groups were tiny. Margins were brutal. A mouth that couldn't help feed itself was a genuine burden that the group had to consciously decide to carry. And sometimes they did. The Shanidar evidence tells us they did, but different in a way that provided something new? Something the group had never seen before but could use? That's a completely different story. The first person born with enhanced vocal capacity might have been frightening, might have been treated as touched, chosen, dangerous, or sacred, depending entirely on the cultural framework of the group around them. Different cultures across human history have treated anomaly as omen, as gift, as curse, as power. What the group believed about difference shaped everything that happened next. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We tend to think of evolution as something that happened to our ancestors, a slow process we observe from a comfortable distance. But the mutations that defined us didn't feel like evolution from the inside. They felt like a child who was wrong, who was strange, who didn't look like everyone else. And the entire trajectory of humanity hung on what the people around that child decided to do. 3 things determined whether the first different human survived long enough to pass the mutation on. First, the nature of the difference itself. Visible enough to provoke a response, but not so severe that survival was impossible without significant support. Second, the group's existing attitudes toward anomaly. Archaeological evidence suggests early humans had complex, varied responses to difference. Burial of individuals with congenital conditions indicates they were considered full members of the group worth mourning. Not all groups, not always, but more than we tend to assume. Third, usefulness. Cold as it sounds, a difference that offered something: better memory, better social cognition, better spatial reasoning, better communication, had a higher chance of being tolerated long enough to reproduce. The group didn't need to understand the genetics. They just needed to notice that this strange person was somehow valuable. The language mutation case is the one that keeps scientists up at night. Because language isn't just useful. Language is transformative. A group with even a crude shared symbolic communication system can coordinate hunts, warn of danger, teach skills across generations, build collective memory. The difference between a group with language and a group without is so vast it barely registers as the same category of organism. But the first person born with enhanced language capacity couldn't have used it alone. Language requires a speaker and a listener. It requires community. It requires other people to develop the same capacity, or at minimum to respond to the new sounds with something other than confusion and fear. The mutation was useless in isolation, which means the survival of the language mutation and every other mutation that defines modern humans depended not just on the individual who carried it, but on the group that surrounded them choosing to engage rather than exclude. Evolution didn't happen to isolated individuals, it happened inside social networks, inside relationships, inside the daily negotiation of who belongs and who doesn't. So what happened to the first human who was born different? We don't know the individual story. We can't. The bones don't hold that level of detail, and the people involved had no way to write it down. But we know the outcome, because you're here. The mutations that make you human, language, abstract thought, complex social cognition, the capacity to imagine things that don't exist yet, all of them passed through exactly this moment. A first carrier, a group decision, a child who survived long enough to have children of their own. Whatever fear or wonder or confusion surrounded that first different person, something in the group chose continuity over rejection, curiosity over elimination, integration over exile. That choice, made in the dark without understanding what was at stake by people who would never know the consequences, is the reason you exist. Every human breakthrough started with someone who didn't fit, and a group that decided for whatever reason to keep them anyway. If that reframed something you thought you understood, good. That's what we're here for. Subscribe, because we go to these places every single video. The uncomfortable, unresolved, genuinely strange history of what it meant to be human. The next one is going to hit differently.